Every parent knows the weight of watching their child's dreams slip away because you can't provide what other families take for granted. Daniel Cole felt that crushing burden every morning when his 11-year-old son Mason tried to hide his disappointment behind a brave smile. When Daniel inherited his uncle's old barn, everyone in town saw it as another piece of bad luck for the struggling single dad. The building was falling apart, sitting on land nobody wanted. Neighbors laughed, saying it would cost more to tear down than it was worth. Daniel had lost his job months earlier, and this felt like one more problem he couldn't solve. But Mason found something hidden beneath the barn floor that changed everything. What they discovered turned the whole town's laughter into shocked silence. A secret worth millions had been waiting in that forgotten place for decades. Would Daniel be able to protect what they found from people who would do anything to take it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Cole had always believed that a man's worth was measured by his ability to provide for his family. At 38, that belief felt like a weight pressing down on his chest every morning when he woke up in the cramped apartment he could barely afford. The sound of Mason's alarm clock through the thin walls served as a daily reminder of how far he'd fallen from the life he'd once imagined for his son. 3 months ago, Daniel had been a project manager at Thompson Construction, earning enough to keep their heads above water. Not wealthy by any means, but stable, steady. Then the company lost its biggest contract, and Daniel found himself among the first wave of layoffs. Last hired, first fired. His supervisor had said with genuine regret, but regret didn't pay the rent or put food on the table. Mason had taken the news with the same quiet resilience he'd shown when his mother passed away 2 years earlier. At 11, the boy had already learned to carry burdens too heavy for his small shoulders. Daniel watched his son pretend that missing the school field trip didn't matter, that wearing the same shoes with holes in the soles was perfectly fine, that eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row was actually kind of fun. The brave smile Mason wore broke Daniel's heart a little more each day. The call about Uncle Henry's death had come on a Tuesday morning while Daniel was hunched over his laptop, scrolling through job listings that all seemed to require experience he didn't have or education he couldn't afford to pursue. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer in Millbrook, the small farming town Daniel had fled 20 years ago after high school graduation. "Mr. Cole, this is Attorney Peterson from Millbrook. I'm calling about your uncle, Henry Cole. I'm afraid he passed away last week." Daniel had stared at the phone, trying to process the information. Uncle Henry, his father's younger brother who'd never married, never left the family farm, never seemed to care much about the nephew who'd chosen city life over rural roots. They'd exchanged Christmas cards for a few years after Daniel moved away, but even that tradition had faded. The last time Daniel had seen his uncle was at his own father's funeral 8 years ago, where Henry had stood apart from the family, weathered hands clasped behind his back, saying little. "I'm sorry to hear that," Daniel had said, and he meant it, though he wasn't sure why. "When is the funeral?" "It was 3 days ago, small service as he requested. But Mr. Cole, there's something else. You're mentioned in his will, quite prominently actually. The inheritance, as Attorney Peterson had explained it, consisted of 40 acres of farmland and the old barn that had stood on the property for over a century. Not much market value, I'm afraid," the lawyer had said with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd delivered disappointing news many times before. "The land's been fallow for years, and the barn needs significant work. But it's yours if you want it." Daniel had almost declined on the spot. What did he need with 40 acres in the middle of nowhere? But something in the lawyer's tone suggested there was more to the story, and with his bank account dwindling and no job prospects on the horizon, even a worthless piece of property seemed like it might be worth investigating. The drive to Millbrook took 4 hours. Mason quiet in the passenger seat as familiar highways gave way to 2-lane roads bordered by cornfields and pastures. Daniel found himself pointing out landmarks from his childhood, the old grain elevator, the creek where he'd learned to fish, the high school where he'd played basketball and dreamed of anywhere but here. "Why did you leave, Dad?" Mason asked as they passed the town limits sign. Daniel considered the question. "I thought there was more out there for me," he said finally. "I thought small towns were places you left behind, not places you came home to. Do you think you were wrong?" The question hung in the air as they drove through Millbrook's main street. The town looked smaller than Daniel remembered, shrunken somehow. Half the storefronts were empty, their windows covered with faded "for lease" signs. The hardware store where he'd bought fishing tackle as a boy was now a dollar store. The movie theater had been converted into a church. But there were signs of life too, new playground equipment in the city park, a coffee shop that hadn't existed when Daniel was young. A group of teenagers gathered outside what used to be Miller's drugstore, their laughter carrying across the street. Maybe Millbrook wasn't thriving, but it was surviving. They found Attorney Peterson's office above the bank, in a building that had probably looked exactly the same for 50 years. Peterson himself was a thin man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He shook Daniel's hand warmly and offered Mason a piece of hard candy from a jar on his desk. "Your uncle was a good man," Peterson said as he spread papers across his desk. "Quiet, kept to himself mostly, but decent. Helped folks when they needed it, never asked for anything in return." "I didn't know him very well," Daniel admitted. "We weren't close. Henry talked about you sometimes. Said you had gumption, leaving town like you did. Said it took courage to chase something different." Peterson adjusted his glasses. "He also said you might come back someday, when you were ready to see what you'd left behind." The property deed was straightforward enough. 40 acres of farmland, a small farmhouse that needed work, and the barn. Peterson drove them out to see it, his ancient Buick bouncing along the gravel road that led to what was now Daniel's inheritance. The farmhouse sat on a small rise, overlooking the fields, its white paint peeling and front porch sagging slightly under the weight of years. But the bones of the structure looked solid, and Daniel could see potential in the wide windows and tall ceilings. It was the kind of house where families gathered for Sunday dinners and children grew up surrounded by space and sky. The barn, however, was another story entirely. It stood about 100 yards from the house, a massive structure that might have been impressive once, but now looked like it was surrendering to gravity and time. The red paint had faded to a rusty brown, and several boards had fallen away from the walls, leaving gaps that let in weather and wildlife. The roof sagged in the middle, and weeds grew up around the foundation high enough to hide small animals. "Been meaning to tell Henry he ought to tear it down," Peterson said as they walked around the structure. "It's become something of an eyesore, truth be told. Probably cost you more to fix than it's worth." Mason, who had been quiet during the drive, suddenly perked up. "Can we go inside?" Peterson looked uncertain. "I'm not sure it's safe, son. Those old timbers might not hold much weight." But Daniel found himself curious too. The barn door hung open just enough for them to slip through, and despite Peterson's concerns, the interior felt solid underfoot. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that streamed through the gaps in the walls. The space was enormous, easily large enough to house modern farming equipment, though it was mostly empty now except for some old hay bales, rusted tools, and what looked like the remnants of Uncle Henry's attempts at organization. "He spent a lot of time out here," Peterson said, following them inside. "Neighbors used to see him coming and going at all hours, never could figure out what he was doing." Daniel walked the length of the barn, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Despite its shabby exterior, something about the place felt right. The proportions were pleasing, the construction solid despite its age. With enough work and money, neither of which he had it could be beautiful again. "What do you think, Mason?" he asked. His son was exploring the far corner where someone had stacked hay bales in what might have been an attempt at organization. "I like it," Mason said simply. "It feels like it's waiting for something." Peterson chuckled. "Out of the mouths of babes. Though I still say you'd be better off selling the land and using the money for something practical." As they prepared to leave, Daniel noticed an envelope tucked into a crack between two wallboards near the door. His name was written on it in Uncle Henry's careful handwriting. Inside, he found a short note that made his heart race. "Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've inherited more than you know. The barn holds our family's greatest secret. Look beneath what seems ordinary. Trust Mason's curiosity. Children see what adults miss. The truth has been waiting for the right moment to surface. That moment is now. Uncle Henry." Daniel folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket without showing it to Peterson or Mason. As they drove back to town, his mind raced with questions. What had Uncle Henry meant? What kind of secret could a broken-down barn possibly hold? That evening, in their motel room, Daniel watched Mason sketch pictures of the barn in the margins of his homework. The boy had always been artistic, creative in ways that reminded Daniel painfully of his late wife Sarah. She would have loved this adventure, would have encouraged Mason's imagination, and probably figured out Uncle Henry's riddle within hours. "Dad," Mason looked up from his drawing, "are we going to live there?" Daniel considered the question. They couldn't afford the apartment much longer, and Millbrook's cost of living was certainly lower than the city. The farmhouse would need work, but it was livable. And there was something appealing about giving Mason space to grow, away from the crowded anonymity of urban life. "Would you want to?" he asked. Mason nodded enthusiastically. "I think Mom would have liked it there." That settled it. Whatever Uncle Henry's secret might be, Daniel and Mason would stay long enough to figure it out. They had nowhere else to go anyway, and Mason deserved better than watching his father struggle to make ends meet in a place that held nothing but reminders of their failures. The next morning, they checked out of the motel and drove back to the property with their few belongings packed in the back of Daniel's aging Honda. The farmhouse smelled like dust and loneliness, but it had good bones and plenty of room. Mason claimed the bedroom with windows facing the barn, and Daniel found himself oddly comforted by the view of rolling fields that stretched to the horizon. As the sun set on their first day as country residents, Daniel stood on the front porch and studied the barn in the fading light. Whatever secret Uncle Henry had hidden there, whatever truth was waiting to surface, Daniel was ready to find it, for Mason's sake and maybe for his own. The first week in the farmhouse passed in a blur of cleaning, unpacking, and trying to make the old place feel like home. Daniel enrolled Mason in the local elementary school, where the boy quickly made friends with children who were impressed by his stories of city life. For Daniel, the adjustment was harder. Millbrook moved at a different pace, one that left him with too much time to think and worry about their dwindling savings. Every morning, Daniel found himself drawn to the kitchen window that looked out toward the barn. Uncle Henry's note remained folded in his wallet, its cryptic message playing through his mind like a song he couldn't quite remember. Look beneath what seems ordinary. What did that mean? And why had Henry specifically mentioned Mason's curiosity? On Saturday morning, Daniel decided it was time to take a serious look at the barn's condition. If they were going to stay in Millbrookend, their financial situation suggested they had little choice. He needed to understand what kind of liability the structure represented. Maybe Peterson was right about tearing it down, but first he should see if there was anything worth salvaging. Mason begged to come along, armed with a notebook and pencil for what he called his barn investigation. Daniel couldn't help but smile at his son's enthusiasm. At least one of them was finding adventure in their circumstances. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the walk across the field to the barn felt like stepping back in time. Daniel had forgotten how quiet the country could be. No traffic noise, no sirens, just the sound of wind through cornstalks and the distant call of a red-winged blackbird. Up close, the barn looked even more weathered than Daniel remembered from their first visit. The foundation stones were solid enough, but the wooden siding showed the effects of decades of harsh weather. Several windows were broken, and the large sliding door that faced the field hung crooked on its track. "Can we fix it, Dad?" Mason asked, running his hand along the weathered wood. "That depends on what we find inside," Daniel said, wrestling with the door until it scraped open far enough for them to enter. The interior was exactly as they'd left, it dusty, cluttered with forgotten equipment, and filled with the musty smell of old hay and wood. But in the daylight streaming through the gaps in the walls, Daniel could better appreciate the barn's construction. The timber frame was massive, built from trees that had probably been growing when Abraham Lincoln was president. Whoever had designed this barn had meant for it to last forever. They spent the morning sorting through the accumulated detritus of decades. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect to find in an old barn-rusted farm tools, coils of rotted rope, feed buckets with holes in the bottom. But Daniel also found signs of Uncle Henry's more recent presence. A relatively new workbench along one wall, modern extension cords snaking between the old support beams, and a collection of reference books about engineering and historical technology. "Dad, look at this," Mason called from the far corner where the hay bales were stacked. Daniel walked over to find his son kneeling beside what appeared to be a perfect square cut into the barn floor. The opening was about 3 feet on each side, covered by wooden planks that fit so precisely Daniel might have missed them entirely, if not for Mason's sharp eyes. "How did you see that?" Daniel asked, impressed despite himself. "The wood grain doesn't match," Mason explained, tracing the edges with his finger. "See, these boards run this way, but the ones underneath go that way. And look," he pointed to small metal handles recessed into the wood. "It's meant to be opened." Daniel knelt beside his son and examined the construction more closely. Mason was absolutely right. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create a concealed entrance here. The craftsmanship was excellent, designed to be invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. "Should we open it?" Mason asked, his voice tight with excitement. Daniel hesitated. Uncle Henry's note had mentioned looking beneath what seemed ordinary, and Mason's curiosity had led them directly to this hidden door. But what if there was nothing down there except an old root cellar or storm shelter? Or worse, what if the structure was unsafe? "Stand back," Daniel said finally. "Let me check it out first." The handles were well oiled despite their age, and the trapdoor lifted easily on hidden hinges. Beneath was a wooden ladder descending into darkness. Daniel could smell cool, dry air rising from below, not the damp, musty odor he'd expected from an underground space. "There's definitely something down there," he told Mason, "but I'm going first." Daniel descended carefully, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. The ladder was solid, and after about 8 feet, his boots touched a concrete floor. Feeling along the walls, he found a light switch that, surprisingly, worked. Fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing a room that took Daniel's breath away. The space was about 20 feet square and 10 feet high, with concrete walls and a floor that looked like it had been poured within the last few decades. But it was what filled the room that made Daniel's heart race. Metal shelving lined the walls, holding hundreds of carefully preserved documents, photographs, and what appeared to be technical drawings. A large table dominated the center of the space, its surface covered with papers held down by glass weights. "Dad," Mason's voice drifted down from above. "What do you see?" "Come down," Daniel called back, his voice hoarse with amazement. "But be very careful on the ladder." Mason descended with the agility of youth, and his gasp when he reached the bottom echoed Daniel's own amazement. "What is this place?" Daniel moved to the central table, where the papers appeared to be organized in some kind of sequence. The top document was a letter, written in the same careful handwriting as Uncle Henry's note. But this letter was addressed to the Cole family legacy, and dated just 6 months ago. "To whoever discovers this archive, what you see before you represents 5 generations of scientific work, hidden away from a world that wasn't ready for these innovations. Our family's greatest secret isn't Shemite's brilliance that was buried by fear and corporate greed. Your great-great-grandfather, Ezra Cole, was apprenticed to Thomas Edison from 1878 to 1882. But unlike Edison's other assistants, Ezra saw beyond the promise of electric light bulbs and phonographs. He envisioned clean energy that could power the world without coal, without oil, without the environmental destruction that even then seemed inevitable. In 1883, Ezra completed his masterwork, a generator that could produce electricity from ambient electromagnetic fields. The implications were staggering. Unlimited clean energy, available anywhere, with no fuel required. But when Ezra tried to patent his invention, powerful interests made sure his application disappeared. His workshop was burned. His life was threatened. So Ezra brought his work here, to the family farm, and continued his research in secret. Each generation since has added to his knowledge, improved his designs, and waited for the right moment to share this gift with the world. That moment is now. The planet needs clean energy more than ever, and our family's long silence has protected this technology until it could make the greatest difference. But be warned, there are still those who would kill to control this discovery. Trust few people, document everything, and remember that the greatest inventions mean nothing if they're not used to help others. Your Uncle Henry was the guardian of this legacy for 43 years. Now that responsibility passes to you. Use it wisely. Henry Cole. Daniel read the letter twice, then looked around the room with new eyes. The documents on the shelves weren't random papers. They were a carefully curated collection of scientific work spanning more than a century. Edison's actual signature appeared on several pieces of correspondence. Detailed technical drawings showed generator designs that looked decades ahead of their time. Photographs depicted men in old-fashioned clothes, standing beside machinery that seemed almost futuristic. "Dad," Mason's voice was barely a whisper. "Is this real?" Daniel picked up one of the Edison letters, holding it carefully by the edges. The paper felt authentic, aged but preserved. The handwriting matched examples he'd seen in history books. If these documents were genuine and everything about them suggested they were, then his family had been keeping one of the most significant scientific secrets in American history. "I think it is," Daniel said. "I think it's very real." Mason moved to one of the shelving units and peered at a photograph of a man who looked remarkably like Daniel himself. "Is that our relative?" "Must be Ezra," Daniel said, joining his son. The man in the photograph stood beside a device that looked like a cross between a radio antenna and a generator, his expression serious but proud. "Your great-great-great-grandfather." They spent the next hour exploring the archive, finding layer upon layer of evidence that supported Henry's letter, patents that had been filed but never approved, newspaper clippings about mysterious fires at inventors' workshops, scientific journals documenting research that seemed impossibly advanced for its time. In one corner of the room, covered by a heavy tarp, they found something that made Daniel's hands shake. Beneath the canvas was a device about the size of a washing machine, its brass and copper components gleaming despite their age. It was clearly the machine from Ezra's photograph, the actual generator that had started everything. "It's beautiful," Mason breathed, and Daniel had to agree. The device was a work of art as much as engineering, its curves and angles creating patterns that were both functional and elegant. A placard attached to the base read, "Ezra Cole, Electromagnetic Generator, Patent Applied 1883, Patent Denied 1884. The future will vindicate what the present fears to embrace. E.C." Daniel sat heavily in a chair beside the table, trying to process what they'd discovered. If the claims in Henry's letter were true, this single device could revolutionize energy production worldwide. But more than that, it represented his family's hidden legacy, generations of brilliance that had been forced into hiding by forces beyond their control. "What do we do now?" Mason asked, echoing the question racing through Daniel's mind. Daniel looked around the archive, at the careful preservation of more than a century of scientific work, at the evidence of his uncle's decades-long guardianship of an impossible secret. He thought about the job rejection letters piling up in his email, about Mason's worn-out shoes and their dwindling bank account, about the town above that had written them off as just another family down on their luck. "First," Daniel said slowly, "we make sure this stays secret until we understand what we're dealing with." And then we figure out how to honor what your Uncle Henry and all our relatives before him worked so hard to preserve. As they climbed back up the ladder into the barn's main floor, Daniel felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, he had a purpose beyond simple survival. He had a legacy to protect and a son to provide for, and somehow, impossibly, those two things might be connected. The barn door scraped shut behind them as they walked back to the farmhouse, but Daniel knew they'd be returning soon. Uncle Henry had been right. The truth had been waiting for the right moment to surface. That moment had arrived, and Daniel was determined to prove himself worthy of the trust his family had placed in him. Daniel spent that night lying awake, staring at the farmhouse ceiling and turning Uncle Henry's revelation over in his mind. Every rational part of him insisted that what they'd found couldn't be real. Inventors didn't hide world-changing technology under barns for over a century. Families didn't keep secrets that significant. And single fathers struggling to pay rent certainly didn't inherit solutions to global energy crises. But the evidence was undeniable. The documents looked authentic. The photographs matched historical records he'd found online. And the generator itself was clearly the work of a master craftsman. More than that, the whole archive felt purposeful, organized by someone who understood the magnitude of what they were preserving. By morning, Daniel had made his decision. Before involving anyone else, he needed to understand exactly what they'd inherited. That meant research, verification, and careful documentation of everything in the underground chamber. After Mason left for school, Daniel returned to the barn with a digital camera and notebook. The hidden room felt different in solitude, more sacred somehow, as if he were entering a shrine to forgotten genius. He began methodically photographing every document, every drawing, every piece of evidence that supported Uncle Henry's claims about their family's scientific legacy. The Edison correspondence proved particularly fascinating. The letters revealed a relationship between the famous inventor and Ezra Cole that went far beyond simple apprenticeship. Edison had clearly respected Ezra's abilities and sought his input on various projects. But more intriguingly, several letters suggested that Edison himself had doubts about the direction of electrical development, worrying about the environmental and social costs of coal-powered generation. Your ideas about ambient energy capture continue to intrigue me. Edison had written in 1882, while I remain focused on practical applications for immediate commercial success, I believe your work may prove more important in the long term. Continue your research, but do so quietly. There are forces at work that would see such innovations suppressed if they threatened existing interests. Daniel photographed the letter carefully, then set it aside and picked up Ezra's response. His ancestor's handwriting was clear and confident, revealing an intellect that seemed decades ahead of its time. I appreciate your counsel about discretion. My experiments with electromagnetic field manipulation have yielded results that exceed my most optimistic projections. The generator produces consistent output using only naturally occurring fields, with no fuel input required. But you're correct about the potential opposition. I've already received visits from representatives of certain coal and oil interests who seem remarkably well informed about my private research. The correspondence continued for months, documenting Ezra's growing concerns about corporate interference and his eventual decision to abandon public development of his technology. The final letter from Edison was dated December 1883, just weeks before Ezra's workshop fire. Your decision to withdraw from public research may be wise, though I regret the loss to scientific progress. I've enclosed what assistance I can provide through private channels. Perhaps future generations will find a world more ready for such innovations. Until then, preserve what you can. Attached to Edison's final letter was a bank draft for $500, a substantial sum in 1883, along with detailed instructions for document preservation and a list of trusted contacts who might assist with authentication. Decades in the future. Daniel set down the correspondence and looked around the archive with new appreciation. This wasn't just a collection of old papers, it was a carefully planned legacy designed to survive until someone could safely bring Ezra's work into the light. His research was interrupted by a knock at the barn door. Daniel quickly turned off the lights in the hidden chamber and climbed the ladder, pulling the trapdoor shut behind him. When he opened the barn door, he found a woman about his age, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Cole, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I teach history at the high school, but I also serve as the town's unofficial historian." She extended her hand with a firm handshake. "I heard you'd inherited Henry's place. I was hoping we might talk." Daniel stepped outside the barn, noting how Dr. Mitchell's eyes swept across the structure with obvious interest. "What can I do for you?" "Your uncle and I were friends," she said. "He used to visit my classes sometimes, sharing stories about local history that weren't in any textbooks. Henry had a fascinating perspective on how technological development might have been different if certain inventors had been allowed to pursue their work freely." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. How much had Uncle Henry shared with this woman? That sounds like an interesting topic for students. Oh, it was. Henry had theories about suppressed innovations, technologies that were abandoned not because they didn't work, but because they threatened existing power structures. Mitchell's gaze returned to the barn. He once mentioned that some of those lost innovations might be closer than people realized. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both studying the barn's weathered exterior. Daniel sensed that Dr. Mitchell knew more than she was saying, but he wasn't ready to reveal what they'd found. Uncle Henry's warnings about trust echoed in his mind. "Would you be interested in looking at some historical documents?" Dr. Mitchell asked suddenly. "I have access to university archives that might help authenticate older materials. Sometimes families discover papers that turn out to be quite valuable, historically speaking." Daniel made a careful decision. "I might take you up on that. I found some old family papers that could use expert evaluation." "Wonderful. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready." Dr. Mitchell handed him a business card, then paused. Henry was a good man who cared deeply about preserving important things for future generations. "I hope you'll continue that tradition." After she left, Daniel stood outside the barn for a long time, considering his next moves. Dr. Mitchell clearly suspected something significant was hidden on the property, and her offer of authentication services could be invaluable. But Uncle Henry's warnings about trust made him cautious about revealing too much too quickly. When Mason returned from school that afternoon, he found Daniel in the hidden chamber, carefully organizing the documents by date and subject. The boy's eyes widened as he took in the progress his father had made. "Have you learned anything new?" Mason asked, settling beside Daniel at the central table. "Quite a bit," Daniel said, showing his son some of the Edison correspondence. "It looks like our ancestor was even more remarkable than Uncle Henry's letter suggested. And it seems like people were trying to stop his work more than a century ago." Mason studied one of Ezra's technical drawings, his finger tracing the careful lines that showed internal components of the generator. "Do you think it still works?" Daniel looked at the device in the corner, its brass components gleaming in the fluorescent light. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out." "Can we try it?" "Not yet. First, I want to understand exactly how it's supposed to function, and I think we need expert help to make sure we don't damage anything." That evening, Daniel called Dr. Mitchell from the farmhouse kitchen while Mason worked on homework at the table. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Daniel Cole. About those historical documents we discussed, I think I'd like to take you up on your offer." "Excellent. When would be convenient?" Daniel looked out the window toward the barn, its silhouette dark against the evening sky. "Tomorrow afternoon, after my son gets home from school. This is something I'd like him to be part of." "Of course. Family history should be shared across generations." After hanging up, Daniel sat at the kitchen table beside Mason and helped him with math, homework, simple arithmetic that felt almost absurdly ordinary given what they'd discovered that day. But there was comfort in the routine, in the familiar rhythm of father and son working together on problems that had clear solutions. "Dad," Mason looked up from his worksheet. Do you think we're going to be okay? Daniel considered the question seriously. 24 hours ago, he would have said their future looked uncertain at best. But now, with Uncle Henry's legacy in their hands and the possibility of a discovery that could change everything, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. I think we're going to be better than okay, he said, ruffling Mason's hair. I think we're going to be extraordinary. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at 3:30 sharp, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of someone who expected to be impressed. Daniel met her at the farmhouse door, noting how her gaze immediately swept toward the barn, as if drawn by magnetic force. Beautiful property, she said as they walked across the field with Mason between them. Henry always said this land held more history than most people realized. Inside the barn, Daniel led them to the concealed trapdoor. Dr. Mitchell's eyes widened when she saw how expertly it had been hidden, and her sharp intake of breath when the lights revealed the archive below told Daniel everything he needed to know about her expectations. My word, she whispered, descending the ladder with careful reverence. Henry wasn't exaggerating. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Mitchell examined documents with the focused intensity of a scholar who'd stumbled onto the discovery of a lifetime. She photographed watermarks, measured paper thickness, and compared handwriting samples with reference materials from her satchel. Her excitement grew with each piece of evidence. This is extraordinary, she said finally, looking up from a letter bearing Edison's letterhead. The paper stock, the ink composition, the historical context, everything authenticates. These aren't reproductions or modern forgeries. You're looking at actual correspondence between Thomas Edison and your ancestor. Daniel felt his knees go weak with relief. Some part of him had been convinced they'd find these documents were elaborate fakes, leaving them back where they started, with nothing but a worthless barn. So it's all genuine. From what I can determine with the resources I have, yes. But Daniel, you need to understand what you're sitting on here. Dr. Mitchell gestured toward the shelves of documents. This isn't just family history. If Ezra Cole really developed functional clean energy technology in the 1880s, and if that technology actually works, you're looking at one of the most significant scientific discoveries in human history. Mason had been quietly examining the generator during their conversation, and now he looked up with the kind of question only a child would ask. Can we turn it on? Dr. Mitchell moved to the device, studying its construction with professional curiosity. The craftsmanship is remarkable. These components look hand-forged, but the precision is extraordinary. And see these connections here. Someone's been maintaining this equipment. The wiring looks modern. Uncle Henry, Daniel said. The letter mentioned that each generation added to Ezra's work. Then it's possible this device actually functions. Dr. Mitchell looked at Daniel seriously. But if it does, you need to be very careful about how you proceed. Clean energy technology represents billions of dollars in potential revenue. There are corporations and governments that would do anything to control this kind of breakthrough. That evening, after Dr. Mitchell left with promises to research historical records that might corroborate their findings, Daniel and Mason sat at the kitchen table making lists of what they knew and what they needed to learn. The process felt overwhelming and exciting in equal measure. The first thing we need to do is document everything, Daniel said, writing careful notes about each major discovery. Photos, measurements, detailed descriptions. If this technology is as important as Dr. Mitchell thinks, we need proof that it belonged to our family first. Mason nodded seriously, then looked up from his own list with a question that went straight to the heart of their situation. Dad, if the generator really works, does that mean we won't be poor anymore? Daniel set down his pen and studied his son's face. Mason was trying to hide his hope, the same way he'd learned to hide disappointment, but the possibility of financial security glowed in his eyes like candlelight. I don't know yet, Daniel said honestly. But even if this discovery changes our circumstances, the most important thing is that we use it responsibly. Your Uncle Henry and all our ancestors before him protected this technology because they believed it should help people, not just make money. Like helping other kids whose dads lost their jobs? Exactly like that. Over the next few days, Daniel and Mason fell into a routine of school, homework, and archive exploration. Each afternoon brought new discoveries that added depth to their understanding of the family legacy. They found evidence that Ezra had continued his research for decades after the initial suppression, developing improvements and refinements that pushed his technology far beyond its original capabilities. More intriguingly, they discovered that subsequent generations had all contributed to the work. Ezra's son had added detailed mathematical proofs. His grandson had incorporated early electronic components. Uncle Henry himself had spent 40 years modernizing the control systems and improving the generator's efficiency. It's like a family project that lasted for over a century, Mason observed one afternoon, as they studied a timeline Daniel had created, showing each generation's contributions. That's exactly what it is, Daniel agreed, and now it's our turn to contribute. But their careful research was interrupted on Friday evening by an unexpected visitor. Daniel answered a knock at the farmhouse door to find a man in an expensive suit standing on the porch, his silver hair perfectly styled and his smile too practiced to be genuine. "Mr. Cole, my name is Marcus Webb. I represent Enertech Industries. I wonder if we might have a conversation about your recent inheritance." Daniel's blood ran cold. He'd been careful not to discuss their discovery with anyone except Dr. Mitchell, but somehow word had leaked to exactly the kind of corporate interests Uncle Henry had warned about. "I'm not sure what you mean," Daniel said carefully. Webb's smile never wavered. "Mr. Cole, let's not waste each other's time. We know you found something interesting on your property. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for whatever materials you've discovered, along with the land itself." "I haven't found anything except an old barn that needs repair." "Of course." Webb reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card along with a check. Daniel's eyes widened at the amount, 50, more money than he'd seen in years. "This is just a good faith gesture. If you're willing to discuss a more comprehensive arrangement, we can multiply that figure considerably." Mason appeared in the doorway behind Daniel, and Webb's attention shifted to the boy with predatory focus. "You must be Mason. I bet you're excited about all the possibilities that come with your father's inheritance." Something in the man's tone made Daniel step protectively in front of his son. "I think you should leave." Webb's smile finally faded. "Mr. Cole, Enertech Industries has extensive resources and considerable influence. We prefer to handle these situations amicably, but we're prepared to explore other options if necessary. I'd hate for this to become complicated for you and your family." "Are you threatening us?" "I'm offering you an opportunity to benefit from what is certainly a very stressful situation, but opportunities don't last forever." Webb pocketed the check and handed Daniel his business card instead. "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." After Webb left, Daniel locked the door and checked all the windows, his heart racing with anxiety. Uncle Henry's warnings about dangerous interests suddenly felt very real and immediate. "Dad?" Mason's voice was small. "Was that man trying to scare us?" Daniel knelt beside his son, choosing his words carefully. "I think he was trying to buy something from us, but we're not ready to sell anything yet. Because we don't know what we have. Because we need to make sure we understand what Uncle Henry wanted us to do with what we've inherited." That night, Daniel called Dr. Mitchell and told her about Webb's visit. Her reaction confirmed his fears. "Enertech Industries is one of the largest energy corporations in the world," she said. "If they're already sniffing around, it means they have intelligence sources that go beyond normal business research. You need to be very careful, Daniel." "What do you recommend?" "Document everything. Get independent verification of your discoveries from multiple sources. And most importantly, don't let them pressure you into making decisions before you're ready." After hanging up, Daniel sat in the farmhouse kitchen and stared out at the barn, now lit by moonlight that made its weathered walls look almost ethereal. Somewhere beneath that ordinary-looking structure lay technology that could change the world. But with that potential came danger for him, for Mason, and for the legacy his family had protected for more than a century. For the first time since inheriting the property, Daniel wondered if Uncle Henry had done him a favor or cursed him with a burden too heavy to bear. But as he watched Mason sleeping peacefully in the next room, he knew there was no turning back. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, honoring the trust that 5 generations of Coles had placed in this moment. The secret was out of its hiding place now, and there was no putting it back. All Daniel could do was prove himself worthy of the responsibility Uncle Henry had passed to him and protect his son from the consequences of their ancestors' brilliance. Marcus Webb returned 3 days later, this time accompanied by 2 associates and an air of barely controlled impatience. Daniel watched from the farmhouse window as the black SUV pulled up the gravel driveway, its tinted windows and aggressive styling looking completely out of place in the rural setting. "Stay inside," Daniel told Mason, who was working on a school project at the kitchen table. "I'll handle this." Daniel met the men on the front porch, positioning himself between them and the house. Webb looked less polished than during his first visit, his expensive suit wrinkled and his practiced smile replaced by something harder. "Mr. Cole, I hope you've had time to consider our offer," Webb said without preamble. "I told you I haven't found anything worth selling." Webb gestured toward the barn. "We have satellite imagery showing unusual electromagnetic signatures emanating from your property. We know you've been spending significant time in that structure. And we know you've been in contact with Dr. Mitchell, who has a reputation for authenticating historical documents." Daniel felt cold dread settle in his stomach. If Enitech was conducting surveillance sophisticated enough to detect electromagnetic signatures, they were dealing with resources far beyond anything he'd imagined. "Even if I had found something," Daniel said carefully, "what makes you think I'd be interested in selling to people who spy on private citizens?" One of Webb's associates stepped forward, a thick-set man whose suit couldn't quite conceal the outline of what was probably a weapon. "Mr. Cole, you're a single father, with no income and mounting debts. Your son deserves better than the uncertainty you're providing. We're offering security. My son deserves a father who stands up for what's right." Webb's expression darkened. "Righteousness is a luxury you can't afford. You have 24 hours to reconsider our offer. After that, things become more complicated." After the men left, Daniel immediately called Dr. Mitchell, who arrived within the hour accompanied by a tall, elderly man she introduced as Professor James Hartford from the State University. James specializes in 19th century American technological history. Mitchell explained as they walked toward the barn. "If anyone can verify the authenticity and significance of what you found, it's him." Professor Hartford proved to be exactly the kind of ally Daniel had hoped for, scholarly, methodical, and utterly unimpressed by corporate intimidation tactics. He spent 3 hours in the archive examining every piece of evidence with the thoroughness of someone who understood the historical implications. "Remarkable," he murmured repeatedly as he worked. "Simply remarkable." His final assessment was unequivocal. "Mr. Cole, you've inherited one of the most significant collections of suppressed technological innovation in American history. These documents prove that clean energy technology was not only possible in the 1880s, but was actively developed and then deliberately suppressed by corporate interests. And the generator itself?" Professor Hartford studied the device with obvious fascination. "Based on these technical specifications and the quality of construction, I believe this machine would function exactly as Ezra Cole intended. The principles are sound, the engineering is extraordinary, and someone has clearly maintained it in working condition." "Uncle Henry," Mason said proudly. "Indeed, your uncle was continuing a family tradition of scientific excellence that spans 5 generations." Professor Hartford looked at Daniel seriously. "But you need to understand the magnitude of what you're facing. If this technology works as advertised, it represents a threat to every major energy corporation in the world. They will not allow it to surface without a fight." That evening, Daniel sat Mason down for a conversation he'd been dreading. His son deserved to understand the risks they were facing, but Daniel struggled to find words that would convey the seriousness without frightening the boy. "Mason, you remember what Uncle Henry wrote about dangerous people wanting to control our family's discovery?" Mason nodded solemnly. "I think those people have found us. The man who came here today works for a company that wants to buy our technology, but I don't think they're planning to use it to help people. So we don't sell it to them. It's not that simple. They have a lot of money and power, and they might try to force us to give them what they want." Mason was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness of someone far older than his 11 years. Finally, he looked up at Daniel with determination that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "Mom always said that doing the right thing is harder than doing the easy thing, but it's worth it in the end." She did say that. "And Uncle Henry protected our family's secret for his whole life, so we could do something good with it, right?" "That's right. Then we protect it too, no matter what." Daniel pulled his son into a hug, amazed by the boy's courage and clarity. "No matter what," he agreed. But even as he made that promise, Daniel wondered if he was being naive about their ability to stand against forces with the resources and ruthlessness of Tech Industries. Webb's visit had made it clear that this was no longer just about family history or scientific curiosity. They were in possession of something that powerful people wanted, and those people weren't going to simply accept no for an answer. The next morning brought another complication. Daniel's phone rang while he was making breakfast, and the caller ID showed Attorney Peterson's office. "Daniel, I'm afraid I have some concerning news," Peterson said without preamble. "Someone's been asking questions about Henry's will and your inheritance. They're claiming there might be irregularities in the documentation." "What kind of irregularities?" "They're suggesting that Henry wasn't of sound mind when he wrote his will, and that his decision to leave everything to you was influenced by outside." Professor Hartford's research over the following days revealed details that transformed Daniel's understanding of both his family's legacy and the forces arrayed against them. Working with university archives and government databases, the professor uncovered a pattern of technological suppression that stretched back to the Industrial Revolution. "Your ancestor wasn't the only inventor whose work was buried," Professor Hartford explained during a late evening meeting in the farmhouse kitchen. "Between 1880 and 1920, dozens of patents for alternative energy technologies were filed and then mysteriously withdrawn or denied. The same companies that controlled coal and oil interests also had significant influence over the patent office." Dr. Mitchell spread out photocopies of historical documents across the table. "We found records of at least 15 inventors whose workshops were destroyed by accidental fires after they developed competing technologies. Ezra Cole was actually one of the lucky ones. She got out before they killed him." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. They killed people over energy patents? Billions of dollars were at stake, Professor Hartford said grimly. The transition to oil-based energy created some of the largest fortunes in human history. Companies like Standard Oil and early electrical monopolies had every incentive to eliminate competition before it could establish itself. Mason looked up from his homework, where he'd been listening to the adult conversation with growing concern. But that was a long time ago. People wouldn't do that now, would they? The adults exchanged glances, and Daniel saw his own fears reflected in their expressions. "Son, there's still a lot of money involved in energy production. Some people might still be willing to do bad things to protect their profits. But we have the law to protect us now, right?" Dr. Mitchell reached over and squeezed Mason's hand. "We do, and we're going to make sure the law is on our side. That's why we're documenting everything so carefully." Professor Hartford had been organizing the photocopied documents while they talked, and now he looked up with excitement. "Daniel, I think I've found something that could change everything. Look at this." He handed Daniel a faded copy of a patent application dated 1884. The document bore Ezra Cole's name and signature, along with detailed technical drawings of the electromagnetic generator. But most importantly, it included an official patent number. This patent was approved, Professor Hartford said. Somehow, Ezra managed to get his application through before the suppression efforts could stop it. That means your family holds the original patent rights to this technology. But it's over a century old, Daniel said. Wouldn't the patent have expired? Normally, yes. But there's a legal principle called patent revival that applies when technologies were suppressed through illegal means. If we can prove that Ezra's patent was deliberately buried and that his technology has been continuously developed by his descendants, we might be able to establish current legal ownership. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward eagerly. That would give you incredible leverage against companies like Enitech. Instead of trying to steal your technology, they'd have to negotiate legitimate licensing agreements. Daniel studied the patent document, hardly daring to hope that the legal situation might be less desperate than he'd feared. How do we prove continuous development? That's where Uncle Henry's work becomes crucial, Professor Hartford said. If we can document that each generation made improvements to Ezra's original design, and that the current generator incorporates those improvements, we can establish an unbroken chain of innovation. They spent the rest of the evening cataloging evidence of each generation's contributions to the family technology. The documentation was remarkably complete. Each Cole descendant had been meticulous about recording their work, as if they'd understood that someday this evidence would be vital. Ezra's son had developed mathematical models that improved the generator's efficiency. His grandson had incorporated early vacuum tube technology. Uncle Henry had added modern control systems and safety features. The progression was clear and well documented, building toward a device that was far more sophisticated than Ezra's original design. It's like watching the entire history of electrical engineering play out in one family's workshop. Dr. Mitchell marveled as she studied the progression of technical drawings. But their research was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the farmhouse. Daniel looked out the window to see 3 black SUVs coming up the driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. "Get Mason and go to the barn," Daniel told Dr. Mitchell and Professor Hartford. "Use the hidden entrance and lock it from inside. Don't come out until I give you the all clear." "Daniel, we're not leaving you to face this alone," Dr. Mitchell protested. "Yes, you are. Mason's safety is more important than anything else, and I need to know he's protected." Professor Hartford was already gathering the most important documents. "If something happens to you, we'll make sure this technology sees the light of day." "Nothing's going to happen to me," Daniel said with more confidence than he felt. "But if it does, remember what Uncle Henry wrote. This technology should be used to help people, not to make corporate executives richer." Mason appeared in the kitchen doorway, awakened by the sound of approaching engines. "Dad, what's happening?" "Just some visitors who need to learn better manners," Daniel said, kissing his son's forehead. "Go with Dr. Mitchell and Professor Hartford. I'll be right behind you." As his allies spirited Mason away through the back door, Daniel took a deep breath and stepped onto the front porch to meet whatever Enitech had planned for him. The SUVs had arranged themselves in a semicircle around the farmhouse, their occupants emerging with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Marcus Webb stepped forward, flanked by more security personnel than seemed necessary for a business negotiation. "Mr. Cole, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your situation." "My situation seems pretty clear," Daniel said. "You want something I'm not willing to sell. What I want is to prevent this from becoming a tragedy for your family." Webb gestured toward the barn. "You've stumbled onto technology that's worth more than you can comprehend, but you lack the resources to develop it safely. People have died protecting far less valuable secrets. Is that a threat?" Webb's smile was cold as winter rain. "It's a statement of historical fact. Your ancestor Ezra Cole disappeared in 1885, shortly after his workshop burned down. Your Uncle Henry died of what the coroner called a heart attack, though no autopsy was performed. Sometimes the pattern repeats itself unless wiser choices are made." Daniel felt rage building in his chest. "You're telling me you killed my uncle?" "I'm telling you that valuable technologies create dangerous situations. The smart play is to accept our offer and walk away with enough money to secure your son's future." The alternative is to risk everything for principles that won't matter if you're not around to benefit from them. The alternative is to honor my family's legacy and make sure their work helps people instead of enriching corporate criminals. Webb sighed as if Daniel's response disappointed him. Very well. You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that, we'll be forced to explore other options for acquiring what we need. As the SUVs pulled away, Daniel remained on the porch until their taillights disappeared into the darkness. Then he walked quickly to the barn, where he found Dr. Four, Mitchell, Professor Hartford, and Mason safe in the hidden chamber. They're gone, he reported, but they'll be back. Professor Hartford looked up from the patent documents he'd been studying. Daniel, I think our timeline just accelerated dramatically. If Enotech is willing to make threats this blatant, they're planning something decisive. What do you recommend? We go public. Tomorrow, we contact the media, present the evidence, and make this discovery so public that suppressing it becomes impossible. Dr. Mitchell nodded agreement. Once the technology is in the public domain, Enotech loses their ability to control it through intimidation. Daniel looked at his son, who had been listening to the conversation with the intense focus of someone whose life was about to change forever. Mason, are you ready for our family to become famous? Mason grinned with the fearless enthusiasm that had always reminded Daniel of Sarah. Are you ready to change the world, Dad? Daniel laughed, despite the gravity of their situation. I guess we're about to find out. The next morning brought an unexpected revelation that changed everything Daniel thought he knew about Uncle Henry's death and the technology they'd inherited. While Professor Hartford worked with Dr. Mitchell to prepare media contacts, Mason made a discovery that shifted their understanding of the entire situation. Dad, there's something weird about this wall, Mason called from the far corner of the archive, where he'd been examining the construction while the adults planned their public revelation strategy. Daniel looked up from the patent documents he'd been organizing. What do you mean? Listen. Mason knocked on the concrete wall, producing a hollow sound that definitely didn't match the solid construction elsewhere in the chamber. It sounds empty behind here. Dr. Mitchell and Professor Hartford joined Daniel in examining the wall. Up close, they could see that what had appeared to be solid concrete construction was actually a false panel, skillfully designed to blend with the surrounding architecture. There's definitely space behind this, Professor Hartford agreed, running his hands along the edges. And look here, these aren't just decorative lines in the concrete, they're actually seams. Daniel found hidden latches concealed within what had appeared to be decorative elements, and the entire panel swung inward on well-oiled hinges. Beyond was another room, larger than the archive, and lit by motion-activated fluorescent fixtures that hummed to life as they entered. What they found took Daniel's breath away. The hidden laboratory was filled with modern equipment computers, testing devices, precision tools, and workbenches that looked like they belonged in a high-tech research facility. But dominating the center of the room was a generator that made Ezra's original device look like a prototype. This machine was clearly the product of decades of refinement and improvement. Its components were precision manufactured. Its control systems featured digital displays and automated monitoring, and its overall design radiated the confidence of mature technology. A placard mounted on its base read, Cole Electromagnetic Generator Mark 7th, completed 2023 by Henry Cole. Uncle Henry was still working, Daniel whispered, moving closer to examine the sophisticated device. Mason discovered a computer workstation along one wall, its screens still active and displaying what appeared to be operational data from the generator. Dad, look at this! It shows power output, efficiency ratings, and something called field harmonics. Dr. Mitchell was studying documentation spread across one of the workbenches. These are recent patents, she said, her voice tight with excitement. Filed under Henry's name over the past 5 years, covering improvements to electromagnetic field manipulation and clean energy generation. Professor Hartford joined her at the workbench, scanning through the modern patents with growing amazement. This is extraordinary. Henry wasn't just preserving Ezra's work, he was actively advancing it. These patents represent breakthrough technologies that are years ahead of anything currently available. But it was Mason who found the most shocking discovery. On a desk near the computer workstation, partially hidden beneath technical manuals, lay a thick folder labeled Tech Surveillance and Corporate Espionage Evidence. Daniel opened the folder with trembling hands, revealing photographs, recorded conversations, and detailed documentation of Enotech's activities over the past decade. Uncle Henry had been conducting counter-surveillance against the corporation, building a comprehensive case that exposed their illegal tactics. The evidence was damning. Recorded phone calls revealed Enotech executives discussing plans to suppress competing technologies through bribery, intimidation, and, when necessary, violence. Photographs showed company operatives breaking into inventors' workshops and stealing research materials. Financial records documented payments to corrupt patent office officials who ensured that threatening innovations never saw approval. Most chilling of all was a medical examiner's report that contradicted the official cause of Uncle Henry's death. According to the independent analysis Henry had commissioned shortly before his death, his symptoms were consistent with poisoning rather than natural heart failure. "They killed him," Daniel said, his voice hollow with shock and rage. "It appears so," Professor Hartford said grimly, but Henry was prepared for that possibility. "Look at this." He handed Daniel a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened upon my death." Inside was a letter that revealed the full scope of Uncle Henry's final plan. "Daniel, if you're reading this, Enotech has probably succeeded in murdering me, just as they murdered other inventors who refused to surrender their work. But my death will serve a purpose they never intended it, will trigger the release of evidence that will destroy them. For 10 years, I've been documenting their criminal activities, building a case that will expose their corruption to the world. The evidence in this laboratory represents not just our family's technological legacy, but proof of systematic suppression of clean energy innovations for over a century. You'll find complete copies of this evidence stored in safety deposit boxes in 5 different states, along with instructions for their release to media outlets and law enforcement agencies. My death was the trigger that set those releases in motion. By the time you read this letter, the evidence is already in the hands of journalists who can't be bought or intimidated. But that's only the beginning. The real goal isn't just to expose Enotech's crime sites, to make our family's technology available to the world in a way that prevents any single corporation from controlling it. In the computer system, you'll find complete plans for manufacturing the generators, along with instructions for establishing an open-source foundation that will license the technology freely to anyone committed to using it for the public good. This is how we ensure that Ezra's vision of clean energy for everyone finally becomes reality. I know this seems overwhelming, but you're not alone. Dr. Mitchell and Professor Hartford have been my allies in this effort for years. They know the full plan and will help you execute it. Trust them as I did. The barn above this laboratory is also more than it appears. The main floor conceals manufacturing equipment that will allow you to... The discovery of Uncle Henry's complete plans transformed their situation from desperate defense to coordinated offense. Over the next 48 hours, Daniel found himself at the center of a carefully orchestrated campaign that Uncle Henry had spent years preparing. Dr. Mitchell took charge of media coordination, using contacts her late friend had cultivated over decades of careful relationship building. Henry was brilliant, she explained, as she worked through a list of journalists and science reporters. He identified reporters who couldn't be bought or intimidated, people with reputations for investigating corporate corruption and technological suppression. Professor Hartford focused on the academic verification process, coordinating with university colleagues who could provide independent authentication of the historical documents and technical specifications. "We need multiple sources confirming everything," he said. "By the time we go public, the evidence has to be so overwhelming that even Enotech's lawyers can't challenge it." Meanwhile, Daniel worked with Mason to understand the manufacturing equipment Uncle Henry had concealed in the barn's main floor. What had appeared to be random farm equipment was actually sophisticated machinery hidden in plain sight. Hay balers that were really precision parts, fabricators, grain storage bins that contained industrial-grade 3D printers. Even the old tractor in the corner was actually a mobile power unit designed to support the manufacturing process. "How did nobody notice this?" Mason asked, as they uncovered yet another piece of camouflage technology. "Uncle Henry was very clever about making everything look ordinary," Daniel said, admiring his uncle's ingenuity. "And most people see what they expect to see: broken-down farm equipment instead of advanced manufacturing systems." The centerpiece of the hidden factory was a complete assembly line for producing demonstration-sized generators. Uncle Henry had perfected the process over years of secret development, creating a system that could produce units quickly and efficiently while maintaining the precision required for the technology to function properly. "We can have 12 demonstration units ready within 72 hours, Daniel reported to Dr. Mitchell and Professor Hartford during their evening planning session. "That should be enough for the media presentation and initial distribution to testing facilities." But their preparations were complicated by escalating pressure from Enatech. Webb's daily visits had evolved into round-the-clock surveillance, with company operatives maintaining positions around the property perimeter. The message was clear: Enatech was monitoring everything while preparing for some kind of decisive action. "They're waiting for something," Dr. Mitchell observed as they watched the surveillance teams through the farmhouse windows. "They could have tried to seize the property by now, but they're holding back." Professor Hartford had been reviewing Uncle Henry's intelligence files, and his expression was grim. "I think I know what they're waiting for. According to these documents, Enatech has corrupted contacts within several federal agencies. They're probably trying to arrange some kind of official seizure eminent domain, environmental violation, tax investigation, something that would give them legal cover for taking control of the property." Daniel felt his stomach clench with anxiety. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say, but Henry's timeline called for going public within 5 days of discovering the laboratory. We're already at day 3. That evening, Daniel received a call that confirmed their worst fears. Attorney Peterson's voice was tense with worry as he delivered the news. "Daniel, federal agents were here today, claiming authority to investigate potential environmental violations on your property. They had paperwork that looked official, but when I called the EPA directly, they had no record of any investigation." "Fake federal agents?" "That's my guess. But they were convincing enough to fool most people, and they'll probably be back with what appear to be legal seizure orders. You need to be ready for anything." After hanging up, Daniel gathered Mason, Dr. Mitchell, and Professor Hartford in the hidden laboratory for what might be their final planning session. The weight of 5 generations of family legacy pressed down on him as he studied the faces of people who had become his closest allies. "Uncle Henry's timeline says we go public tomorrow," Daniel said. "The question is whether we're ready." "The demonstration units are functional," Mason reported proudly. He'd become surprisingly adept at working with the manufacturing equipment, his natural curiosity translating into genuine technical skill. "I tested 3 of them this afternoon, and they all produce exactly the power output the specifications predict." Professor Hartford nodded approvingly. "The academic verification is complete. We have statements from 5 major universities confirming the authenticity of the historical documents and the viability of the technology. No one will be able to dismiss this as fraud or fantasy." Dr. Mitchell checked her notebook of media contacts. 15 journalists from major outlets are confirmed for tomorrow's press conference. 3 television networks, 2 major newspapers, and several online science publications, plus representatives from the Department of Energy and the Patent Office. Daniel looked around the laboratory, taking in the sophisticated equipment, the carefully preserved historical documents, and the faces of people who had chosen to risk everything to support his family's legacy. Uncle Henry had indeed prepared them for this moment, but success would ultimately depend on Daniel's ability to articulate why their technology mattered and why it needed to be protected from corporate control. "There's one more thing," Daniel said, pulling out a document he'd been carrying since discovering Uncle Henry's final plans. "The Foundation Charter. Once we sign this and file it with the state, the technology becomes legally protected as open-source innovation. No corporation will be able to claim exclusive ownership. But that also means we can't profit from it, the way a traditional patent would allow," Professor Hartford pointed out. Daniel looked at Mason, who was examining one of the demonstration generators with the focused intensity he'd inherited from his mother. His son's worn-out shoes and too small jacket reminded Daniel of why they'd come to Millbrook in the first place, not to get rich, but to find a way forward when everything else had failed. "Uncle Henry was right," Daniel said finally. "This technology is too important to be controlled by people who only care about profit. If we can establish the foundation and license the generators affordably to communities that need clean energy, we'll make enough to support ourselves while helping millions of people." Mason looked up from his examination of the generator. "And other kids won't have to worry about their dads losing jobs because of environmental problems." "That's the idea." "Then let's do it." Dr. Mitchell smiled at the boys' certainty. Out of the mouths of babes. They spent the rest of the evening rehearsing the presentation, reviewing technical specifications, and preparing for questions that skeptical reporters would inevitably ask. Daniel practiced explaining the science in terms that non-technical audiences could understand, while Mason worked on his own presentation about how young people could contribute to clean energy innovation. As midnight approached and they prepared to return to the farmhouse, Daniel took one last look around the laboratory that had become the command center for their campaign. Tomorrow, this hidden room would be revealed to the world, along with technology that could revolutionize global energy production. "Uncle Henry," he said quietly, addressing the memory of the man who had sacrificed everything to make this moment possible, "I hope we're worthy of what you've given us." The generator hummed softly in response, its electromagnetic fields creating a barely audible harmony that seemed to echo with the voices of 5 generations of coal innovators. Tomorrow, their century-long silence would finally end, and the world would learn what happened when ordinary people refused to let corporate greed bury extraordinary discoveries. Daniel locked the laboratory door behind them and led his small team back to the farmhouse, where they would spend their last night as guardians of a secret. By tomorrow evening, they would either be celebrated as the family that gave clean energy to the world, or they would be destroyed by forces too powerful to overcome. But as Daniel tucked Mason into bed and listened to his son's excited whispers about tomorrow's adventure, he knew they had already won the most important battle. They had honored Uncle Henry's trust, protected their family's legacy, and proven themselves worthy of the courage their ancestors had shown for more than a century. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and they would face it with the knowledge that they had chosen principle over profit, family over fear, and hope over the easier path of surrender. The press conference began at 10 o'clock sharp on a crisp October morning that felt charged with possibility. Daniel stood beside the barn that had hidden his family's greatest secret, facing an audience of reporters, scientists, and officials whose skepticism was evident in every questioning glance. Marcus Webb sat in the front row, alongside a team of Enatech lawyers, his expression radiating confidence that whatever Daniel was about to present could be discredited or suppressed. Behind the corporate representatives, genuine journalists leaned forward with notebooks ready, their professional curiosity engaged by advanced materials that had promised revolutionary clean energy technology. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "My name is Daniel Cole, and I'm here to share a story that began in 1882, when my great-great-grandfather worked as an apprentice to Thomas Edison." He gestured toward the display boards Professor Hartford had prepared, showing photographs and documents that traced the family's scientific legacy across 5 generations. What you're about to see represents more than a century of suppressed innovation technology that could have changed the world decades ago, if it hadn't been buried by corporate interests more concerned with profit than progress. A reporter from the Washington Post raised her hand. Mr. Cole, these are extraordinary claims. What evidence do you have that this technology actually works? Daniel smiled, remembering Uncle Henry's advice about letting the technology speak for itself. I'm glad you asked. Mason, would you do the honors? His 11-year-old son stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks mastering every aspect of their family's invention. Mason approached the first demonstration UNITA generator, about the size of a large microwave, and activated its control panel with practiced ease. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The unit hummed to life, its electromagnetic fields creating a visible distortion in the air around it. Digital displays showed rapidly climbing power output numbers, while attached measuring equipment confirmed that the device was producing electricity without any external power source. This generator is producing 12 kilowatts of clean electricity, Mason announced to the stunned audience. That's enough to power an average home, and it's using only naturally occurring electromagnetic fields. No fuel, no emissions, no environmental impact. A murmur of amazement rippled through the crowd as the demonstration continued. The generator's output remained steady and consistent, its displays showing stable performance that defied conventional understanding of energy production. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward to address the technical questions that were already being shouted from the audience. Independent testing by 3 major universities has confirmed that this technology functions exactly as claimed. We have verification from MIT, Stanford, and the University of Chicago that these generators produce more energy than they consume, using only ambient electromagnetic fields. Professor Hartford unveiled additional evidence, including the original Edison correspondence and patent documentation that established the historical foundation for the technology. This isn't new science, he explained. The theoretical framework was established in the 1880s. What's new is the engineering refinement that allows practical application. Webb finally stood, his corporate composure cracking as he realized the magnitude of what was being revealed. This presentation is premature and potentially dangerous, he announced. Enertech Industries demands immediate suspension of these demonstrations, pending safety review by qualified engineers. Daniel had been waiting for this moment. Mr. Webb, I believe you're familiar with our family's technology already. Perhaps you'd like to explain to these reporters why Enertech has been conducting illegal surveillance of my property and threatening my family. The accusation sent a shockwave through the audience. Reporters immediately focused on Webb, notebooks and cameras, capturing his obvious discomfort as he struggled to respond. Enertech Industries has simply been monitoring potential environmental hazards, Webb said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. We had no knowledge of the specific nature of Mr. Cole's activities. Then how do you explain these recorded conversations? Dr. Mitchell activated a portable speaker that began playing audio from Uncle Henry's surveillance files. Webb's voice was clearly recognizable as he discussed plans for acquiring the Cole technology through intimidation and legal manipulation. The effect on the assembled media was electric. Reporters who had come expecting a crackpot inventor's fantasy instead found themselves witnessing the exposure of corporate conspiracy and criminal activity. Cameras swung between the working generators and Webb's increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. Furthermore, Professor Hartford announced, we have documented evidence that Enertech Industries has been systematically suppressing clean energy innovations for decades, using methods that include bribery, theft, and murder. He activated a projector that displayed photographs and documents from Uncle Henry's investigation. The evidence was overwhelming, a pattern of criminal activity that stretched back decades and implicated Enertech in the deaths of multiple inventors. Mason stepped forward again, his young voice cutting through the chaos with remarkable clarity. My Uncle Henry spent his whole life protecting this technology so it could help people, instead of making rich companies richer. He died because he wouldn't let them steal our family's work. The boy's words hit the audience like a physical blow. Here was an 11-year-old child, articulating the moral stakes of technological innovation with a clarity that seasoned adults had missed. Cameras captured his earnest expression as he continued. Our generator can provide clean electricity to places that don't have power, to people who can't afford expensive energy, to communities that want to stop polluting the environment. That's what my great-great-great-grandfather wanted when he invented it, and that's what we want now. Webb made one final attempt to regain control. This technology is unproven and potentially hazardous. Enertech Industries calls for immediate federal intervention to prevent. His words were cut off by the arrival of actual federal agents, not the fake ones Enertech had been using, but legitimate FBI investigators who had been triggered by Uncle Henry's evidence releases. The lead agent approached Webb with handcuffs ready and a warrant that had clearly been prepared in advance. Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corporate espionage, and accessory to murder, the agent announced as cameras captured every moment. You have the right to remain silent. As Webb was led away in handcuffs, Daniel felt a profound sense of vindication wash over him. Uncle Henry's plan had worked perfectly. The truth was out. The criminals were being arrested, and the technology was now protected by the full attention of the international media. But the press conference was far from over. With Enertech's intimidation tactics exposed and their representatives under arrest, the focus shifted back to the revolutionary potential of the Cole family's invention. Dr. Mitchell called a reporter from Scientific American, "What are the implications if this technology can be scaled up for widespread use?" "Transformational," she replied without hesitation. "We're looking at the potential end of fossil fuel dependence, dramatic reduction in energy costs, and electricity access for billions of people who currently live without power." Another reporter pressed for specifics. When could this technology become commercially available? Daniel stepped forward to answer, remembering Uncle Henry's vision for how the technology should be shared. "We're establishing an open-source foundation that will license the generator designs to any organization committed to using them for public benefit. Manufacturing could begin within months for qualified partners. And the cost? Much lower than current alternatives. Because the generators require no fuel and minimal maintenance, the total cost of ownership over their lifetime is a fraction of conventional power systems." As questions continued and cameras rolled, Daniel watched Mason demonstrate the technology with the natural enthusiasm of someone who had grown up surrounded by innovation. His son had found his calling in this family legacy, and Daniel could see that the boy would carry their work forward into the next generation. The morning that had begun with uncertainty and fear was ending with vindication and hope. Uncle Henry's sacrifice had not been in vain. His careful planning had protected the technology, exposed the criminals who had suppressed it, and created the foundation for sharing clean energy with the world. But even as Daniel savored their victory, he knew this was only the beginning. The real work, manufacturing the generators, establishing the foundation, and ensuring the technology reached communities that needed it most, lay ahead. Uncle Henry had given them the tools for success, but it would be up to Daniel and Mason to use those tools wisely. As the press conference concluded and reporters rushed to file stories that would change the energy industry forever, Daniel put his arm around Mason's shoulders and looked out over the fields where 5 generations of Coles had lived and worked and dreamed. "What happens next, Dad?" Mason asked. Daniel smiled, feeling more hopeful about the future than he had in years. "Next, we get to work changing the world." The legal proceedings that followed the press conference moved with unprecedented speed, driven by media attention that made suppression impossible and evidence that was too overwhelming to challenge. Within hours of Webb's arrest, federal investigators had seized Enertech's corporate headquarters and begun unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the energy industry. Daniel found himself at the center of a legal whirlwind that validated every aspect of Uncle Henry's decades-long investigation. The evidence his uncle had gathered proved not just Enertech's crimes, but systematic corruption that had shaped energy policy for over a century. "The scope of this conspiracy is staggering," said Federal Prosecutor Margaret Chen during a briefing at the local courthouse. "We're looking at RICO violations, multiple homicides, patent fraud, and bribery reaching into federal agencies. Your uncle's documentation has given us everything we need to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise." Mason sat beside Daniel during the legal proceedings, taking careful notes in a journal he'd begun keeping about their family's adventure. The boy seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing history, and he wanted to record every detail for future generations. "Will the bad people go to jail?" Mason asked during a break in the proceedings. "Many of them, yes," Prosecutor Chen replied with the kind of certainty that comes from having overwhelming evidence. "Your uncle was very thorough in documenting their crimes." The validation Daniel had hoped for came through multiple channels simultaneously. Patent attorneys confirmed that Ezra Cole's original patents had indeed been illegally suppressed, and that continuous development by his descendants had maintained the family's legal rights to the technology. University researchers verified that the generators functioned exactly as claimed, producing clean energy with efficiency levels that exceeded anything previously achieved. Most importantly, the international response exceeded Uncle Henry's most optimistic projections. Governments from 12 countries sent representatives to witness demonstrations of the technology, and 3 developing nations immediately requested licensing agreements to bring clean electricity to rural communities that had never had reliable power. "This is exactly what Uncle Henry envisioned," Dr. Mitchell said as they reviewed licensing requests in the farmhouse kitchen that had become their temporary headquarters. "Technology that serves people instead of corporate profits." The Cole Foundation's legal framework proved to be as brilliant as Uncle Henry had claimed. By establishing the technology as open-source innovation with specific licensing requirements, they had created a structure that prevented any single entity from gaining monopolistic control while ensuring that the technology would be used responsibly. Professor Hartford was particularly impressed by the Foundation's governance structure. Henry designed this to evolve with changing needs while maintaining core principles. The board includes scientists, ethicists, and community representatives, people who understand that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. But the most satisfying moment came when Enertech's board of directors, facing criminal charges and public disgrace, attempted to negotiate a settlement that would give them access to the Cole technology. Their lawyers approached Daniel with an offer that included billions of dollars in exchange for exclusive licensing rights. Daniel's response was swift and final. "The technology isn't for sale. It belongs to the world now, and no amount of money will change that." The rejection sent shockwaves through the corporate energy sector, where executives had assumed that sufficient financial pressure could eventually overcome any principled resistance. They had fundamentally misunderstood both Daniel's character and the legal protections Uncle Henry had carefully constructed. The legal proceedings that followed the press conference moved with unprecedented speed, driven by media attention that made suppression impossible and evidence that was too overwhelming to challenge. Within hours of Webb's arrest, federal investigators had seized Enertech's corporate headquarters and begun unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the energy industry. Daniel found himself at the center of a legal whirlwind that validated every aspect of Uncle Henry's decades-long investigation. The evidence his uncle had gathered proved not just Enertech's crimes, but systematic corruption that had shaped energy policy for over a century. "The scope of this conspiracy is staggering," said Federal Prosecutor Margaret Chen during a briefing at the local courthouse. "We're looking at RICO violations, multiple homicides, patent fraud, and bribery reaching into federal agencies. Your uncle's documentation has given us everything we need to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise." Mason sat beside Daniel during the legal proceedings, taking careful notes in a journal he'd begun keeping about their family's adventure. The boy seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing history, and he wanted to record every detail for future generations. "Will the bad people go to jail?" Mason asked during a break in the proceedings. "Many of them, yes," Prosecutor Chen replied with the kind of certainty that comes from having overwhelming evidence. "Your uncle was very thorough in documenting their crimes." The validation Daniel had hoped for came through multiple channels simultaneously. Patent attorneys confirmed that Ezra Cole's original patents had indeed been illegally suppressed, and that continuous development by his descendants had maintained the family's legal rights to the technology. University researchers verified that the generators functioned exactly as claimed, producing clean energy with efficiency levels that exceeded anything previously achieved. Most importantly, the international response exceeded Uncle Henry's most optimistic projections. Governments from 12 countries sent representatives to witness demonstrations of the technology, and 3 developing nations immediately requested licensing agreements to bring clean electricity to rural communities that had never had reliable power. "This is exactly what Uncle Henry envisioned," Dr. Mitchell said as they reviewed licensing requests in the farmhouse kitchen that had become their temporary headquarters. "Technology that serves people instead of corporate profits." The Cole Foundation's legal framework proved to be as brilliant as Uncle Henry had claimed. By establishing the technology as open-source innovation with specific licensing requirements, they had created a structure that prevented any single entity from gaining monopolistic control, while ensuring that the technology would be used responsibly. Professor Hartford was particularly impressed by the Foundation's governance structure. Henry designed this to evolve with changing needs while maintaining core principles. The board includes scientists, ethicists, and community representatives, people who understand that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. But the most satisfying moment came when Enatech's board of directors, facing criminal charges and public disgrace, attempted to negotiate a settlement that would give them access to the Cole technology. Their lawyers approached Daniel with an offer that included billions of dollars in exchange for exclusive licensing rights. Daniel's response was swift and final. "The technology isn't for sale. It belongs to the world now, and no amount of money will change that." The rejection sent shockwaves through the corporate energy sector, where executives had assumed that sufficient financial pressure could eventually overcome any principled resistance. They had fundamentally misunderstood both Daniel's character and the legal protections Uncle Henry had carefully constructed. "We're receiving licensing applications from over 40 organizations," Dr. Mitchell reported, as they prepared for the Foundation's first board meeting. Universities, non-profit groups, municipal utilities, and developing world governments, all committed to using the technology for public benefit. The transformation of their lives felt surreal to Daniel. 6 weeks earlier, he had been an unemployed single father, facing eviction and failure. Now he was the director of a foundation that controlled technology capable of revolutionizing global energy production. The contrast was so dramatic it sometimes felt like a dream. But Mason grounded him in reality with observations that cut straight to the heart of their situation. "Dad, do you think Mum would be proud of what we're doing?" Daniel pulled his son close, feeling the familiar ache that Sarah's memory always brought. "I think she'd be amazed by how brave and smart you've been through all of this. And yes, I think she'd be very proud of both of us. Because we chose to help people instead of getting rich. Because we chose to honor our family's legacy the right way." The legal victory was complete when a federal judge issued a permanent injunction preventing any entity from claiming exclusive ownership of the Cole electromagnetic technology. The ruling specifically cited Uncle Henry's evidence of corporate suppression and recognized the Cole Foundation as the legitimate steward of innovations that belong to humanity as a whole. This decision establishes precedent that will protect future inventors from the kind of suppression your family endured. The judge explained in his ruling, "Technology that can benefit all humanity should not be controlled by private interests seeking only profit. Marcus Webb received a 25-year prison sentence for his role in the conspiracy, while Enertech Industries was dissolved and its assets distributed to victims of their criminal activities. The executives who had ordered Uncle Henry's murder were facing life sentences, their decades of crimes finally catching up with them. But for Daniel, the most meaningful vindication came from smaller, more personal victories. The town of Millbrook, which had initially mocked his inheritance of a worthless barn, now celebrated the Cole family as local heroes who had chosen community over corporate greed. Children at Mason's school wrote essays about how ordinary families could accomplish extraordinary things through courage and determination. "The kids at school think I'm famous now," Mason reported one evening as they walked through the fields where 5 generations of Coles had lived and worked. "But I told them the real hero was Uncle Henry for protecting our family's secret until we were ready to share it." Daniel smiled at his son's wisdom. At 11 years old, Mason understood something that many adults never grasped, that true heroism often involved sacrifice and patience rather than dramatic gestures. As they stood beside the barn that had hidden their family's greatest treasure, Daniel felt the presence of all the ancestors who had contributed to this moment. Ezra's brilliant innovation, his son's mathematical refinements, his grandson's engineering improvements, and Uncle Henry's patient guardianship had all led to this victory over forces that had seemed insurmountable. The technology was safe now, protected by law and public attention, in ways that would prevent future suppression. The foundation was established and operational, with licensing agreements that would bring clean energy to communities around the world. And most importantly, Mason had found his calling in the family tradition of innovation and service. "What happens next?" Mason asked, echoing the question that had become their family motto. Daniel looked out over fields that would soon house the Cole Foundation's headquarters and training facility, where young inventors from around the world would come to learn how technology could serve humanity rather than exploit it. "Next," Daniel said, "we keep our promise to Uncle Henry and make sure our family's gift reaches everyone who needs it." As father and son walked back toward the farmhouse that had become the center of a technological revolution, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. They had honored their family's legacy, protected their ancestors' vision, and proven that ordinary people could triumph over extraordinary corruption when guided by principle rather than profit. The humiliation that had brought them to Millbrook had transformed into something far more valuable than wealth or purpose that would guide their family for generations to come. 6 months after the press conference that changed everything, Daniel stood in the doorway of what had once been Uncle Henry's barn and marveled at the transformation. The weathered structure now housed the Henry Cole Innovation Academy, a state-of-the-art facility where young inventors from around the world came to learn how technology could serve humanity's greatest needs. The morning sun streamed through new windows that had replaced the gaps in the old walls, illuminating workbenches where teenagers from 6 different countries collaborated on clean energy projects. Mason moved among them like a natural teacher, his enthusiasm for the family technology infectious as he helped younger students understand the principles behind electromagnetic field manipulation. "The key is remembering that we're not creating energy," Mason explained to a group of 12-year-olds gathered around a demonstration unit. "We're capturing energy that's already there in the environment. My great-great-great-grandfather figured that out in 1882, but it took our family 5 generations to perfect the engineering." Daniel smiled at his son's confidence. At 12 now, Mason had grown into his role as both student and mentor, embodying Uncle Henry's vision of education that combined technical knowledge with ethical responsibility. The boy understood that their family's technology was just the beginning, that the real goal was inspiring others to pursue innovations that could make the world better. Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached Daniel, carrying the quarterly report from the Cole Foundation that documented their progress in bringing clean energy to communities worldwide. Her role had evolved from historical consultant to the Foundation's executive director, and Daniel was grateful for her steady guidance through the complexities of international technology transfer. "The numbers are extraordinary," she said, handing him the report. "We now have licensing agreements with organizations in 47 countries. The generators are providing electricity to over 2 million people who previously had no reliable power source." Daniel scanned the statistics with satisfaction. Rural villages in Africa, where children could now study after sunset. Island communities in the Pacific that no longer depended on expensive diesel fuel. Native American reservations achieving energy independence for the first time in generations. Each success story represented Uncle Henry's vision becoming reality. "And the financial sustainability?" Daniel asked. "Better than projected. The licensing fees are modest, but they're sufficient to support the foundation's operations and fund expansion into new regions. We're actually turning down requests because we can't keep up with demand." Professor Hartford emerged from the Academy's research wing, where graduate students worked on refinements to the basic generator design. The elderly scholar had taken semi-retirement from the university to focus full-time on the historical documentation of technological suppression, turning Uncle Henry's evidence into a comprehensive academic study. "Daniel, you need to see this," he said, his excitement evident despite his typically reserved demeanor. "The students have developed a miniaturized version of the generator that could be integrated into individual homes. We're looking at the possibility of complete energy independence at the household level." Daniel followed Professor Hartford to a workbench where a device the size of a computer tower hummed quietly while powering the entire research wing. The implications were staggering. If every home could generate its own clean electricity, the traditional power grid might become obsolete within decades. "This is exactly what Ezra envisioned," Daniel said, studying the compact generator. Energy production returned to individual communities instead of being controlled by massive corporations. "The students are calling it the Mason generator," Professor Hartford said with a grin, "in honor of our youngest researchers' contributions to the project." Mason looked up from his teaching duties, blushing at the recognition but clearly pleased. "It wasn't just me," he protested. "Sarah from Kenya figured out the field harmonics, and Chen from Taiwan solved the heat dissipation problem." "Collaboration," Dr. Mitchell observed approvingly, "just as it should be." The Academy's success had attracted attention from educational institutions worldwide, leading to partnerships that extended the Cole family's influence far beyond their original expectations. MIT had established an exchange program that brought their best engineering students to rural Millbrook for hands-on experience with clean energy innovation. The United Nations had designated the Academy as a UNESCO site for sustainable technology education. But the most meaningful recognition came from the community that had initially dismissed Daniel and Mason as just another struggling family down on their luck. Millbrook had embraced its role as the birthplace of revolutionary technology, with local businesses thriving as students and researchers from around the world brought economic vitality to the small farming town. "Mayor Thompson wants to know if you'll speak at the town council meeting next week," Dr. Mitchell said. "They're dedicating a historical marker to commemorate Ezra Cole's original workshop." Daniel nodded, remembering the whispers and sideways glances that had followed them during their first weeks in Millbrook. The transformation felt like vindication not just for his family, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated because of circumstances beyond their control. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel found himself walking the familiar path from the academy to the farmhouse that remained his and Mason's home. The building had been renovated and expanded to accommodate visiting scholars and foundation staff, but the kitchen where they'd first studied Uncle Henry's cryptic note remained unchanged, a reminder of how far they'd traveled from those early days of uncertainty and fear. Mason joined him on the front porch as the sun began to set over fields that now hosted wind measurement stations and solar testing arrays. The boy had grown taller over the past months, but more importantly, he had grown into himself confident in his abilities, clear about his values. and excited about a future where technology served humanity's highest aspirations. "Dad," Mason said, settling into the chair that had become his favorite spot for evening conversations. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found the trapdoor?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I think Uncle Henry would have found another way to get our attention. He was very determined about making sure his legacy reached the right hands. Do you think we've lived up to what he wanted?" Daniel looked out over the academy where young inventors from around the world worked together on projects that could change history, at the foundation that had distributed clean energy technology to millions of people who needed it most, and at his son, who had found his calling in the family tradition of innovation guided by conscience. "I think we've exceeded what he hoped for," Daniel said, "and I think your mom would be amazed by the young man you're becoming." Mason was quiet for a moment, processing the compliment with the seriousness that had always made him seem older than his years. "I want to make sure the next generation understands what we learned," he said finally. "That technology isn't about making money or gaining power, it's about solving problems that help everyone live better lives." Daniel pulled his son close, marveling at the wisdom that came so naturally to someone who had grown up surrounded by principled innovation. That's exactly the right lesson to pass on. As stars appeared in the darkening sky above Millbrook, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them from humiliation to purpose, from financial desperation to meaningful work, from isolation to community leadership. Uncle Henry had been right about the technology changing their lives, but he might not have anticipated how completely it would transform their understanding of what mattered most. The barn that had once seemed like a burden had become the foundation for a global movement toward clean energy independence. The inheritance that had felt like a cruel joke had proven to be the greatest gift imaginable. And the son, who had hidden his disappointment behind brave smiles, now radiated the confidence of someone who knew his life had purpose beyond his own immediate needs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the foundation expanded into additional countries and the academy welcomed its largest class of students yet. There would be technical problems to solve, political obstacles to navigate, and the ongoing responsibility of stewarding technology that could reshape civilization itself. But tonight, as father and son sat together on the porch of a farmhouse where 5 generations of visionaries had dreamed of a better world, Daniel felt the deep satisfaction that comes from honoring a family legacy while building something entirely new. They had taken Uncle Henry's carefully protected secret and transformed it into hope, made manifest clean energy flowing to communities that had never imagined such possibilities. Young minds inspired to pursue innovation guided by conscience, and a small farming town that had become the unlikely center of a technological revolution. The humiliation that had brought them to Millbrook felt like a lifetime ago. In its place was the knowledge that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for people brave enough to look beneath what seems ordinary and discover the extraordinary potential that lies just out of sight. Uncle Henry's legacy was secure, but more importantly, it was alive and growing in the hands of people who understood that true wealth comes not from what you can take, but from what you can give to those who need it most. The barn's last season had ended, but its greatest chapter was just beginning.